My son pointed at the front door like I was a stranger in his house. "Give it 3 days, Dad," Eric said. "You'll come crawling back." Melissa, my daughter-in-law, actually laughed. "You can't survive without us." I looked down at the overnight bag in my hand. 66 years old, widowed. No house of my own anymore. And after 14 months of cooking their meals, waiting for their deliveries, keeping track of their repairs, and cleaning up problems they barely noticed, they had somehow convinced themselves that I was the helpless one. For one terrible second, I almost believed them. Then I walked out. The first 3 days were harder than Eric would ever know, but I never went back. 3 months later, my son came to see me. He expected a lonely old man counting the days until his family took him in again. Instead, he found people calling my name in the hallway, a manager asking for my advice, neighbors saving me a seat at their table, and a life I had built without asking his permission. Eric smiled, but his eyes didn't. That was when everything changed. Because my son didn't just hate seeing me survive without him. He began trying to make sure I couldn't. And what he used against me wasn't some ridiculous lie. He used the truth, my mistakes, my grief. Even one of the worst days of my career. By the time I discovered what he had done, my reputation was hanging by a thread. But Eric had made one mistake. He thought the man who walked out of his house was still the father who would clean up every mess his son created. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. My name is Art Whitaker. I was 66 years old, a retired facilities coordinator who had spent 35 years keeping public school buildings running through broken boilers, leaking roofs, busted pipes, and every other problem people only noticed after something stopped working. My wife, Nancy, had been gone nearly 2 years, and after I sold the house we had shared, I moved in with my son Eric and his wife Melissa, telling myself it would only be temporary. 14 months later, I was standing barefoot in their kitchen staring at a blue ceramic platter broken into 6 large pieces and a scatter of smaller shards. I knew exactly what it was before Melissa said a word. Her mother's. She had shown it to me more than once. Hand-painted blue flowers circled the rim, faded in places where fingers had carried it through years of birthdays and Sunday dinners. Melissa's mother had died when Melissa was 28, and that platter was one of the few things she had kept from her childhood home. That morning, before leaving for work, Melissa had set it near the back of the kitchen counter. "Art, please don't move the blue platter," she had said. "I already cleaned it. I need it tonight." I remembered her saying it. That was the part that made my stomach sink. Around 3 that afternoon, I had been putting groceries away while trying to reach a serving bowl behind it. I moved the platter 6 inches to the right. Then the dryer buzzed in the laundry room. The doorbell rang, and I turned too quickly. My elbow caught the edge. I tried to grab it. My fingertips brushed the ceramic. Then it hit the tile. Melissa came home 20 minutes later. She stopped in the doorway. Her purse slid down her arm. For a second, she did not seem to breathe. "What happened?" I knocked it off the counter. Her eyes moved from the pieces to me. "I told you not to touch it." "I know. I specifically told you." "I know, Melissa." She crouched beside the broken pieces but did not touch them. I could see her eyes filling. That hurt more than if she had yelled immediately. "I'm sorry," I said. I moved it to reach something behind it. I should have put it back first. She stood so quickly her purse hit the chair. "You should have listened." "You're right. One thing, Art. I asked you for one thing." I swallowed. There was nothing useful I could say. I had made the mistake. "I'll see if it can be repaired." She gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Of course, because everything is just another repair to you." I looked at her. "That's not what I meant. You always have an explanation." "I'm not explaining it away." "Yes, you are." Her voice rose. "You forget what I tell you. You move things. You put things where I can't find them, and then I come home and have to figure out what happened." That landed differently. I looked around the kitchen. The groceries she had texted me to buy were put away. Chicken was thawing in the refrigerator for dinner. 2 loads of laundry were folded on the chair near the hallway. The guest bathroom had fresh towels because Melissa's coworker and her husband were coming over that night. Beside the fruit bowl lay a yellow legal pad. Melissa's handwriting filled half the page. "Groceries, laundry, guest bath, chicken out by 2, wait for package between noon and 3, trash cans to curb." I picked up the paper. Melissa saw it in my hand. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to understand something." "What?" I held up the list. "You asked me for one thing?" Her expression hardened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make this about everything you do around here." I apologized for the platter, and then immediately started keeping score. No, I put the paper down. I'm trying to tell you there's a difference between me making a mistake and you talking to me like I'm an employee who failed an inspection. Nobody treats you like an employee. I looked at the list again. When was the last time you asked if I had plans before leaving one of these? Her mouth opened, then closed. The front door opened before she answered. Mel? Eric came into the kitchen, loosened his tie, then saw her face. What happened? Melissa pointed toward the floor. Your dad broke my mother's platter. Eric looked at me. The blue one? Yes. He knew what it meant to her. His jaw tightened. Dad, she told you not to touch that. I know. Then why did you? I forgot for a minute and moved it. Eric rubbed a hand across his face. Come on. I said I was sorry. Melissa folded her arms. He thinks I treat him like hired help. Eric looked from her to me. Where did that come from? I pointed to the yellow list. 14 months of that. Eric stared at it like he did not understand what he was supposed to see. Dad, those are chores. I know what they are. You live here. Everybody helps. Everybody? His face changed. I had seen that look when he was a teenager and knew he had been cornered by a question he did not like. Melissa said, I work all day. So did I for 35 years. That has nothing to do with this. No, it has everything to do with this. I know what work looks like. Eric stepped between us slightly. Dad, enough. I looked at him. I broke something important to Melissa. That was my fault. But I'm not going to apologize for saying something else is wrong here. Eric exhaled sharply. You're acting like we make you scrub floors for food. I buy most of the groceries. And you live here for practically nothing. The kitchen went still. I had contributed toward utilities every month. I had bought food without keeping receipts. I had never thought of any of it as rent. Apparently Eric had, he continued. Helping around the house is the least you can do. I felt something inside me settle. Not exploda. Settle. Is that what this is? Eric frowned. What? My payment for being here. Oh, for God's sake. Cooking, cleaning, repairs, shopping, waiting for deliveries, keeping track of your service appointments. Is that rent? Melissa shook her head. You're twisting this. No, I think I'm finally saying it out loud. Eric pointed toward the hallway. If living here is so awful, nobody's forcing you to stay. I looked at his hand, then at him. Are you asking me to leave? He had time to answer, time to lower his hand, time to say he was angry and did not mean it. Instead, he said, maybe some distance would be good. I nodded once. All right, Dad, don't be dramatic. But I was already walking toward my room. I packed underwear, 2 shirts, jeans, my shaving kit, medication, and the old leather-bound household notebook I had kept for years. Service numbers, appliance models, warranty dates, the sort of information nobody noticed until they needed it. When I came back down, Melissa was standing near the kitchen island. She looked at the bag. You're seriously leaving? You both seem to think that's best. She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. You can't survive without us. Eric opened the front door. Give it 3 days, Dad. You'll come crawling back. I walked past him without answering. Before the first night was over, I had already picked up my phone twice to call my son. The first time I picked up the phone, I told myself I only wanted to let Eric know I was safe. The second time, I knew better. I was sitting on the edge of a narrow motel bed with my shoes still on, staring at his name on the screen. The room was clean enough, but everything in it felt temporary. The lamp gave off a weak yellow light. The little refrigerator hummed too loudly. Somewhere down the hall, an ice machine dropped a load of cubes with a metallic crash that made me look up every time. I had spent most of my adult life in houses full of sound. Nancy humming in the kitchen, Eric running up and down the stairs when he was young. Later, the television in one room, a dryer going in another, somebody asking me where the batteries were, or whether I could look at a loose cabinet hinge. Now nobody needed anything. I should have felt relieved. Instead, the silence pressed against me. My pension and Social Security meant I was not stranded. I could pay for the motel, I could buy food, I could afford rent somewhere modest if I was careful. But money did not answer the question that kept circling in my head. Where did I belong now? By the second morning, I had convinced myself that calling Eric would not mean surrendering. Maybe we could talk calmly. Maybe he had cooled down. Maybe Melissa had too. I sat at the little table by the window and pressed my thumb against Eric's contact. Then I remembered his face when I had asked if he truly wanted me gone. He had been given a chance to take it back. He hadn't. Going back that morning would not change what had happened. It would only teach all three of us that the next time they crossed a line, I would eventually return and pretend it had never been there. I locked the phone and set it face down. Then I opened my laptop and started looking for apartments. The first few listings were ridiculous. Brand new complexes with granite countertops, fitness centers, dog spas, and monthly rents that made me laugh out loud. I did not need a rooftop fire pit. I needed a clean place, a decent lock, and enough room to make coffee without bumping into the bed. Around noon, I drove to a diner I had passed the night before. I ordered coffee and a turkey sandwich and spread a few apartment listings beside my plate. You moving or planning a bank robbery? I looked up. The woman in the booth across from me was smiling. She looked to be in her 70s, with short silver hair and bright red reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Moving, I said. That explains the expression. Bank robbers look more cheerful. I laughed despite myself. She nodded toward the papers. Anything decent? Depends how you define decent. That bad? Either too expensive or trying very hard to convince me I need a swimming pool. She introduced herself as Dorothy Hanley, though she told me everyone called her Dot. I'm 72, she said, as if that explained something. I'm past paying extra rent for a pool I'm never getting into. That was how I heard about Maple Court. Dot had lived there for 9 years. She described it as old brick, stubborn plumbing, decent neighbors, and management that tried harder than most. The apartments aren't fancy, she said, but nobody's pretending they're fancy either. That afternoon, I called. The manager, Marilyn Price, told me she had one studio available and could show it before 5. Maple Court sat behind a row of maple trees that looked older than some of the buildings around them. The complex was clearly from another era. Nothing matched perfectly. One section of brick was darker from a repair years ago. The railings had been painted more than once. I liked it immediately. Marilyn was a practical-looking woman in her late 50s with a clipboard under one arm and the expression of someone who had heard every excuse a tenant could invent. The studio was small but clean. A real kitchen, a full bathroom, a window facing a patch of grass instead of a parking lot. While Marilyn was explaining the lease terms, a voice called from outside. Marilyn, this window's stuck again. Dot was standing near the ground floor unit next door, pushing at a window that refused to move. Marilyn sighed. Craig was supposed to look at that. I stepped closer, but kept my hands to myself. Mind if I take a look? Marilyn nodded. I leaned toward the frame. Layers of old paint had built up along the track. I could see where someone had forced it before. Hardware may be fine, I said. Looks like paint buildup along the channel. If somebody keeps forcing it, they may damage the latch and turn a small job into a bigger one. Marilyn looked at the window, then at me. You do maintenance? Not exactly. What did you do? Facilities coordination, public schools. For how long? 35 years. That got her attention. I explained that I had managed work orders, vendors, inspections, emergency calls, budgets, and more leaking roofs than I cared to remember. She did not ask me to fix the window. I did not offer. That mattered to me. For once, seeing a problem did not automatically make it mine. I filled out the application that afternoon. Income verification, identification, references, background information. Marilyn told me approval would take a few business days. I went back to the motel and waited. 2 days later, she called and asked me to stop by. I assumed she wanted another signature. Marilyn closed my application folder and said, "You know, I may have a different kind of problem you could help me solve." Marilyn's different kind of problem turned out to be less mysterious than it sounded. Maple Court was not falling apart. It was simply running on too many scraps of paper, phone messages, and people assuming somebody else had followed up. I moved into the studio 3 days later with 6 boxes, 2 suitcases, and a coffee maker. The place looked even smaller once my things were inside, but for the first time since I had left Eric's house, the key in my pocket belonged to a door nobody could point me through in anger. Marilyn met me in the office that morning, handed me a key, then pointed toward a metal tray overflowing with maintenance slips. "That," she said, "is part of my problem." Craig Nolan was Maple Court's maintenance technician. He handled the physical work, leaking faucets, loose railings, stuck doors, garbage disposals, and whatever else an older apartment complex produced each week. The problem was that requests came in from everywhere. Residents called Marilyn. They stopped Craig in the parking lot. They left notes under the office door. Vendors showed up on the wrong day. One woman had called 3 times about a bathroom light because each message had been written on a different sheet. Residents called twice because nobody told them a part had been ordered. A broken closet handle could sit beside a loose stair rail simply because both were written on the same pad. I spent 15 minutes looking through the pile. You don't have a maintenance problem, I told Marilyn. You have a traffic problem. She leaned back. That sounds cheaper. It usually is. I asked for 4 folders and labeled them: safety, essential service, routine repair, cosmetic. A loose handrail went into safety. No heat in January would be essential service. A dripping faucet might be routine unless it was causing damage. Peeling paint could wait. Then I suggested every request get a date, apartment number, contact method, status, and next action. Marilyn stared at the folders. You just did in 10 minutes what I've been trying to explain for 6 months. I had 35 years of practice. She tapped the desk. I can't pay you much. For what? 12 hours a week to start. Resident Services Coordinator. You log requests, help me prioritize them, schedule vendors, and make sure residents know what's happening. I'm not looking to become the maintenance man. Good. I already have one. As if summoned, Craig walked into the office carrying a toolbox. He was 48, broad through the shoulders, with the tired expression of a man who had been called about too many toilets on too many weekends. Marilyn introduced us and explained the arrangement. Craig looked at the 4 folders, then at me. So physical work still comes through me? Yes, Marilyn said. I nodded. That's how it should be. He did not smile. Residents are going to figure out fast that you know buildings. Then somebody asks you to tighten a railing. Somebody else wants you under a sink. And suddenly nobody knows whether you work for Marilyn, me, or every tenant with a screwdriver. I thought he was marking territory. Maybe he was, but he was also right. I won't take side jobs, I said. Good. His answer was flat enough that I decided we were not going to become fishing buddies soon. Later that afternoon, Craig showed me where completed work orders were kept. He noticed the school district name on an employment reference Marilyn had copied. 35 years around public schools? 35. You're telling me nothing ever went sideways? I laughed. Plenty went sideways. Worst one? For a moment I saw Jefferson Middle in winter. Fire trucks at the curb, parents outside, reporters across the street. My name printed larger than it deserved to be. One boiler job nearly ended my career. Craig raised an eyebrow. Your fault? I slid a completed form into the routine repair folder. Depends which newspaper headline you read. He waited for more. I did not give it to him. That story belonged to another life. By 5 o'clock, my new desk held a calendar, 4 folders, a legal pad, and 1 coffee stain I had already made myself. For the first time since leaving Eric's house, I had spent a day solving problems nobody expected me to solve for free. My phone buzzed. Melissa, where did you keep the replacement furnace filters? I typed, basement storage shelf, left side, behind the shop towels. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. Do you remember which company serviced the water heater last year? I gave her the name. Then I looked around the office. At Maple Court, Marilyn wanted me to create a system so other people could find answers. At Eric's house, I had somehow become the system. I was still thinking about that when Melissa called. Art, one more thing, she began. Then Eric's voice cut through from somewhere behind her. Why am I suddenly supposed to know where everything is? Eric's question came through Melissa's phone so clearly that for a second I forgot she was the one who had called me. Because it's your house. She snapped back at him. Then to me, in a lower voice, do you remember whether the furnace company keeps the service records? Or did you? In the black binder in the hall closet. Second shelf. She thanked me and hung up. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, my phone became a customer service line for the house I no longer lived in. Eric wanted to know what day bulk trash was collected. Melissa asked where the dishwasher warranty was. Eric called because he could not remember who had installed the garage door opener. Melissa texted a photograph of an air filter and asked whether it was the right size. None of the questions was difficult. That was what bothered me. They were not helpless. For years, I had simply made it unnecessary for them to remember. I had always been the one who said, I'll handle it. When Eric was younger, that meant checking his tires before a long drive or reminding him when his registration was due. After Nancy died and I moved in with him and Melissa, it expanded into nearly everything that kept a household from stumbling over small problems. Doing it myself had always seemed faster than explaining. Now, I was beginning to see what faster had cost us. At Maple Court, I tried to work differently. If I learned which vendor handled the elevators, I wrote it down. If Marilyn changed a procedure, I updated the shared binder. If Craig told me a plumbing company responded faster on weekends, I put that information where both of them could find it. I also started a new notebook, not the old leather one filled with Eric's appliance numbers and service dates. This one stayed at Maple Court. Contacts, procedures, recurring issues, follow-up dates. One afternoon, Mrs. Keller from Building C stopped me near the mailboxes. "Art, could you look at my bathroom cabinet? One door is hanging crooked." I followed her upstairs before thinking much about it. The hinge was loose. I was explaining what kind of screw would probably solve it when Craig appeared in the doorway carrying a toolbox. He looked at me, then at the cabinet. "You working this one?" "I was just looking." "That's how it starts." Mrs. Keller glanced between us. Craig kept his voice calm. "If residents start pulling you into apartments for little jobs, pretty soon people will tell me Art already approved something I never saw. I didn't approve anything. I know. I'm telling you where this goes. I did not like being corrected in front of a resident. That probably meant I needed to hear it." I stepped back. "You're right. I should have logged it." Craig nodded and examined the hinge himself. For the rest of the afternoon, his words stayed with me. Nobody knows where your responsibility ends. I had spent years in Eric's house without knowing where mine ended. A few days later, Dot asked me to look over 3 estimates for replacing her bathroom flooring and vanity. She had already hired contractors to inspect the work. We sat at her kitchen table with the estimates spread between us. One was cheap because it left too many things vague. Another bundled labor and materials together. The third cost more but clearly explained what she was paying for. "I'm not asking you to choose," Dot said. "I just want to understand them." So I explained the differences. She asked questions, made notes, then circled one estimate. "All right," she said. "Coffee?" I looked at the paperwork. "Anything else you want me to check?" "No." "Another repair?" "No." "Then what's the coffee for?" She stared at me over her glasses. "Art, sometimes coffee is just coffee." I laughed. We sat by her window for almost an hour talking about Nancy buying Christmas decorations every January, Dot's late husband getting lost on the same fishing lake 3 summers in a row, and why neither of us trusted mashed potatoes served with an ice cream scoop. When I left, I realized Dot had not asked me to fix, organize, carry, schedule, or remember anything. She had still wanted me there. That evening, Eric called. He asked 2 questions about the house before his voice changed. "Dad." "What?" "When are you coming home?" I looked around my small apartment. My coffee cup was in the sink. My notebook lay on the table. Nobody else's unfinished work was waiting for me. "I'm not," I said. He laughed softly, as if I had made a joke. I didn't. 3 months after I walked out, Eric showed up at Maple Court carrying a box and wearing the nicest smile I had seen from him since I left. Eric was standing outside my building with a cardboard box tucked under one arm and a paper grocery bag in the other. For half a second, I thought something was wrong. Then he smiled. "Relax, Dad. I'm not here to drag you home." I looked at the box. "What's all that?" "Mail. A couple shirts, your good jacket, some things you left in the hall closet." He lifted the paper bag. "And coffee, the decent kind." That surprised me more than the visit. I stepped aside and let him into the apartment. Eric looked around slowly. There was not much to see. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a second-hand dining table Dot had helped me find, and 2 framed photographs I had finally unpacked. One was Nancy standing beside Lake Erie with the wind blowing her hair across her face. The other was Eric at 12 years old holding a fish barely large enough to justify the grin he wore. "This is nice," he said. "It works. No luxury pool?" I decided to survive without one. He laughed. It was the first easy laugh we had shared since I left. He set the box down near the table. "You really settled in." "I told you I had." "I know. I guess hearing it and seeing it are different." Before I could answer, there was a knock. Dot stood outside holding a casserole dish. "Oh," she said when she saw Eric. "You must be the son." Eric glanced at me. "My reputation got here before I did?" "Only your face. Art has your picture." Dot introduced herself and handed me the dish. "You left this at my place." Then she looked at Eric again. "Your father keeps us organized around here." I'm beginning to hear that. There was nothing sharp in his voice, but something about the way he said it made me study him. Dot left, and Eric helped me carry the box into the bedroom. On the way back downstairs, we passed Marilyn near the office. "Art," she called. "Do you have a minute?" Eric stopped beside me. Marilyn held a vendor estimate. The refrigeration company says Mrs. Peters needs a new unit. Craig thinks we should get another opinion. I read the first page. The estimate recommended full replacement based on poor cooling and intermittent compressor noise. Did anyone check the condenser coil? Marilyn frowned. I don't know. If it's clogged badly enough, the system can overheat and mimic bigger problems. I'd have Craig check that before anyone approves replacement. Marilyn made a note. That's what I needed. Eric watched the exchange. You do this all day? 12 hours a week officially. Marilyn smiled. Unofficially, he notices things. I gave her a look. Within my job description. She laughed and went back into the office. We had barely reached the lobby when Mrs. Peters came through the front entrance carrying 2 grocery bags. She recognized Eric beside me. Is this your son? It is. She set one bag down long enough to shake his hand. Your father saved me from spending $1,400 last week. I didn't save you anything yet. You stopped me from agreeing to it. The coil was dirty, and the refrigerator works. She pointed toward me. That man thinks before he spends other people's money. Eric smiled politely. I'll keep that in mind. But after she walked away, he was quiet. Back at the apartment, I made coffee. Eric sat at my table and looked around again. Then he said, I'll admit it, Dad. You look good here. I did not know how much I had wanted to hear something like that until he said it. Thanks. I mean it. After Mom died, I worried about you. I know. And when you left, he rubbed his thumb along the edge of his cup. I figured you were angry. I didn't think this would become permanent. It wasn't permanent at first. But now? I looked toward Nancy's photograph. Now it feels like home. He nodded slowly. For a few minutes, I let myself believe we might finally be finding a way to talk without one of us defending something. Then Eric asked, casually, So what exactly is your title here? Resident Services Coordinator. That mean Marilyn's your boss? She manages the property. And Craig, maintenance. So you handle the people and paperwork? More or less. He smiled. Sounds like you. At the time, the questions seemed harmless. A son trying to understand his father's new life. When we left the apartment, Eric insisted on carrying the empty box downstairs. Near the lobby, he stopped in front of the Resident Services Board. My name was printed beneath Marilyn's and beside the office hours. Art Whitaker, Resident Services Coordinator. Eric looked at it longer than I expected. I almost made a joke. Instead, he turned back to me. I'm glad you found something, Dad. I believed him. I thought the hesitation in his face was pride mixed with the awkwardness between us. I thought my son had finally accepted that I could build a life without him. A week later, Melissa called to tell me their marriage was coming apart. Melissa did not waste time with small talk. Art, she said, I think Eric and I are in trouble. I was standing at the Maple Court office counter with a stack of vendor invoices in front of me. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. What kind of trouble? She let out a long breath, the kind where every conversation turns into an argument. I moved away from the counter and stepped into the empty community room. What happened? At first, nothing dramatic. Laundry, dinner, the garage door. Who forgot to call the plumber? Who was supposed to pick up groceries? She gave a tired laugh. Stupid things. They don't sound stupid if you're fighting about them every day. No, they're not anymore. I sat down. Melissa kept talking, slowly at first, then faster, as though once she started, she had been waiting weeks to say it. Eric came home late and expected dinner to be handled. Melissa expected him to notice when the dishwasher detergent was gone. Neither remembered the furnace appointment I had always scheduled. A small leak under the upstairs sink sat for 3 days because each assumed the other had called someone. None of it was impossible. That was the point. They were both capable adults, but they had built their lives around an invisible third set of hands. Mine. It's not just chores, Melissa said. It turned into money, time, who does more, who notices things, who doesn't. I leaned back in the chair, and she went quiet. Then she said, I didn't understand how much you were doing. I looked through the community room window toward the parking lot. For months, I had imagined hearing those words. I had expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. You understand now? Yes. It was not an apology, not quite, but it was closer to honesty than anything she had given me the night I left. She continued, Eric keeps saying we were fine before you moved out. You weren't? We were better at avoiding things. That answer surprised me. She told me the worst fight had happened 2 nights earlier. Eric had come home after 8. Melissa had spent the evening dealing with a contractor who failed to show up, a pile of laundry, and a grocery delivery that was missing half the order. Eric told her she was overreacting. Melissa told him he had no idea how much she was carrying. Then he said she seemed to manage fine when I lived there. That was when she answered him, "Your father did more around this house than you ever admitted." I closed my eyes for a second. What did Eric say? He thought I was comparing you to him. Were you? I was comparing what got done. That's not the same thing. It wasn't to him. She described Eric going quiet in the way he always did when anger became more dangerous than shouting. Then he accused her of treating him like a disappointment. Melissa told him that was not what she meant. He told her she had been happier when his father was around because somebody else was doing the work. She told him maybe that should tell him something. Then Eric went upstairs. 20 minutes later, he came back down carrying a bag. I sat forward. Melissa left? No. Her answer came quickly. Eric did. That was not what I expected. He's at a hotel. For how long? I don't know. My first instinct arrived before I could stop it. I should call him. I should tell him to go home. I should tell Melissa what to say, so he would listen. I knew Eric's stubbornness. I knew how to wait until he cooled down. I knew which words made him defensive and which ones got through. For most of his life, that knowledge had made me the person standing between Eric and consequences. My hand was already reaching for my keys. I stopped. "What?" Melissa asked. "Nothing. You sound like you're about to say something." I looked at the keys on the table. "This is between you and Eric." Silence. "Art, I thought maybe you could talk to him." There it was. The old assignment. "I could," I said, "but I'm not going to." She did not like that. I could hear it in the pause. "You're his father, and you're his wife. That's not fair." "No, but it's true." She ended the call soon after. That night, I kept thinking about Eric's visit to Maple Court. His smile, the way he watched Marilyn ask me for advice, the way Mrs. Peters thanked me, the way he stared at my name on the board. At the time, I had thought he was adjusting to seeing me independent. Now I wondered whether he had seen something else. Maybe Melissa's words had struck harder because he had already watched strangers respect the man he had expected to come crawling home. Still, I did not accuse him of anything. A strained marriage was not evidence of a plan. The next morning, Marilyn was waiting for me when I arrived at the office. She was holding a single printed page. "Art, I need to talk to you before you start." Something in her voice made me put my coffee down. She told me regional management had received a call about my work at Maple Court. "What kind of call?" "A conseil." "About what?" She hesitated. "Your memory." I stared at her. Marilyn slid the report toward me. Whoever called said they were family. I read the report twice before I looked back at Marilyn. "Recent memory problems?" "That's what the caller said." "What exactly am I supposed to be forgetting?" Marilyn pressed her lips together. "They didn't give a list. They said people here may be depending on you more than they should." I felt heat rise into my face. 3 months earlier, Eric had told me I could not survive without him. Now someone was telling Maple Court that other people could not safely depend on me. Regional management had not fired me. Marilyn made that clear. Until they reviewed the concern, I could continue scheduling vendors, updating records, and handling routine office follow-up. What I could not do was advise residents directly on maintenance decisions or step into anything that might be interpreted as physical repair work. It was a reasonable precaution. It still felt like being put behind glass. By lunchtime, people noticed. Mrs. Peters stopped beside my desk with a question about her refrigerator. Before I could answer, Marilyn gently said, "Craig will handle that one." Mrs. Peters looked confused. "So Art doesn't do this anymore?" "Just temporarily." She gave me a concerned look before leaving. That look bothered me more than the restriction itself. For the first time since arriving at Maple Court, people were looking at me and wondering whether something might be wrong. My mind went immediately to Craig. I did not like that it did, but the path was obvious. He had warned me twice about crossing boundaries. He had watched residents come to me first. He had made it clear he did not want two people acting like maintenance supervisors. Late that afternoon, I found him in the supply room checking inventory. "Craig," he looked over his shoulder. "You got a minute?" "Depends. Did you contact regional management about me?" He stopped writing. Then he put the clipboard down. "Yeah." The answer hit me harder because there was no hesitation. "You reported me?" "Yes." I stared at him. "So all those warnings weren't enough?" "What warnings?" "About me doing too much. Residents coming to me." "You decided to tell them I was having memory problems?" His expression changed. "I never said anything about your memory. Management got a complaint." "I know. From someone saying I shouldn't be trusted when people depend on me. That wasn't mine." I gave a short laugh. You just admitted you reported me. I reported what I told you I was going to report if it kept happening. Craig opened a metal filing cabinet and pulled out a copy of a form. He handed it to me. His complaint was dated almost 2 weeks earlier. I read every line. Art Whitaker has repeatedly been approached by residents for informal maintenance assistance outside his coordinator responsibilities. The note mentioned the cabinet hinge at Mrs. Keller's apartment. It mentioned another resident asking me to inspect a loose closet shelf. Then Craig had written, "Continued overlap could create confusion regarding authorization, liability, and responsibility for completed work." That was it. No reference to my age. No mention of Nancy. Nothing about forgetfulness. Nothing suggesting I was incompetent. I read it again because I wanted to find something that justified how angry I had been with him. Instead, I found something worse. He had a point. "You could have told me you filed this. I did tell you I was worried about it." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said, "but neither is me filing a workplace concern and somebody telling management your mind's going." I folded the page carefully. "I accused you of something you didn't do." "Yes. I'm sorry." Craig studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "Would have suspected me too." That surprised me. He picked up his clipboard again. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're losing your memory. Comforting. You're still doing too much." There was almost a smile in his voice. I left the supply room feeling smaller than when I went in, but also clearer. Craig had criticized me. He had not betrayed me. There was a difference, and I had been too angry to see it. Back in the office, Marilyn had the anonymous concern open on her computer. "There's a sentence you should see." She turned the screen toward me. I read it. "He means well, but he gets in over his head when people depend on him." My hand stopped on the edge of the desk. I had heard that language before. After Nancy died, when Eric thought I was taking on too much too quickly, he had said almost the same thing. "Dad means well, but when people depend on him, he gets in over his head." At the time, I thought it was concern. Now the words were sitting inside a complaint at Maple Court. I did not tell Marilyn what I was thinking. Not yet. One familiar sentence was not proof. The following morning, a second message arrived, this one carrying a 12-year-old newspaper headline with my name underneath it. The headline was 12 years old, but seeing my name under it still made my stomach tighten. "Jefferson Middle evacuated after boiler failure. Facilities coordinator's decision questioned." Marilyn printed the article and placed it beside the anonymous complaint. "You mentioned this once," she said, to Craig. "So it happened?" "The boiler failed. The headline happened too. The part they left out took 6 weeks to prove." She waited. I had spent years trying not to tell that story unless I had to. Now somebody had dragged it into Maple Court and stripped away everything except the ugliest version. Jefferson Middle had been one of our older buildings. During a scheduled winter repair, I approved a work order based on specifications submitted by a heating contractor we had used before. The component listed on the paperwork met district requirements. The component they actually installed did not. 2 weeks later, the boiler shut down during morning classes. There was no explosion, but smoke from an overheated assembly triggered alarms, and the school was evacuated until the fire department and inspectors cleared the building. Nobody was injured. That did not matter to the television cameras. My signature was on the original authorization. For several days, that was enough to make me the easiest person to blame. "What changed?" Marilyn asked. "The serial numbers." The contractor's invoice listed the approved component. Photographs taken after the shutdown showed something different. When investigators dug deeper, they found the company had substituted a cheaper, uncertified part after I signed the original order. Then somebody altered internal paperwork to make the substitution look approved. The district investigation cleared me. The contractor lost its relationship with us and faced consequences of its own. "But that article never got the same attention," Marilyn said. The follow-up ran on page 6. The first story had been above the fold. That was how reputation worked sometimes. The accusation arrived carrying a trumpet. The correction came in wearing slippers. Marilyn folded her hands. "I believe you. I appreciated that. Unfortunately, belief was not the same thing as documentation. Regional management had an insurer, policies, residents in their 70s and 80s, and vendors whose work I helped coordinate. They could not ignore an article suggesting I had once authorized unsafe repairs simply because I told them the headline was misleading. By noon, the decision came down. My paid coordinator duties were suspended while I provided the final district findings and management reviewed the complaints. Not terminated, suspended. Marilyn made sure I understood the distinction. It did not feel like much of one when I cleared my coffee mug from the office desk. Dot found me near the mailboxes 20 minutes later. Marilyn said, "You're taking a few days off." That's one way to put it. She narrowed her eyes. What happened? Some questions about my work history. That sounds vague enough to be annoying. It is. She glanced toward her apartment. My bathroom contractor is coming tomorrow. Will you look over the final scope before I sign? The answer rose automatically. Of course. Then I stopped myself. I can't. Dot blinked. You can't read an estimate? I can. But right now management is deciding whether I've been operating outside the role they gave me. If I start doing private favors while I'm suspended, I make Marilyn's position harder. Dot studied me for a moment. Then she nodded. All right. No argument. No disappointment. Just acceptance. That should have made refusing easy. It did not. Walking back to my apartment without solving her problem felt wrong in a way I could not explain. That evening, Marilyn emailed me the material regional management had received so I could begin gathering documentation. I read the anonymous complaint again. The boiler article was attached. So was a short description of what the caller called my recent pattern. One paragraph made me stop. It referred to the winter after Nancy died. Poor sleep, missed appointments, difficulty concentrating. A period when, according to the writer, I wasn't always himself. I stared at those words. That winter had been bad. There was no point pretending otherwise. For weeks after Nancy's funeral, I slept in 2-hour stretches. Once, I drove halfway to the grocery store before realizing I had left my wallet on the kitchen table. I missed a dentist appointment. I showed up on the wrong Thursday for lunch with an old coworker. Grief had made ordinary things feel strangely distant, but none of that had ever appeared in a newspaper. It was not in any personnel file. Maple Court could not have discovered it through a background check. Somebody had taken a public incident from my professional life and placed it beside private memories from one of the most vulnerable periods of my life. Separately, they meant different things. Together, they created a picture. An aging widower, forgetful, overconfident, a man whose judgment could no longer be trusted. For the first time, I stopped thinking of the complaint as concern. Somebody was building a case. That night, I opened a fresh notebook, wrote down everyone who knew about that winter, and put Eric's name at the top. Eric's name sat at the top of the page for a long time before I wrote anything beneath it. I did not want suspicion to become certainty just because I was angry. That was how bad investigations started. For 35 years, when a school building developed a problem nobody could explain, I learned not to chase the loudest theory. You built the sequence first. What happened? When? Who knew what? What changed before the failure? So I did the same thing with my own life. At the top of the page, I wrote the date Eric visited Maple Court. 1 week later, Melissa called to tell me their marriage was coming apart. The next morning, regional management received the family complaint. Then came Craig's separate workplace complaint. Then the anonymous message using Eric's phrasing. Then the boiler article. Then my suspension. I drew a line beneath the dates and stared at them. Coincidences happened. Patterns did too. I needed to know which one I was looking at. My first call the next morning was to the school district. The woman in records had not known me personally, but when I explained what I needed, she found the old Jefferson Middle file number and told me the final investigation had been archived. Can I get a certified copy? You can request one. How long? A few business days. I filled out the request before I did anything else. Then I called Frank Dawson. Frank had been my supervisor during the boiler mess and retired 5 years before I did. He answered on the 4th ring. Art Whitaker. Either you miss me or something broke. Something old came back. That took the humor out of his voice. I told him about the article. He remembered immediately. That contractor nearly buried both of us. I need to be sure I'm remembering the sequence correctly. You approved the specified part. They installed a substitute. Serial number proved it. Their internal paperwork had been altered after the fact, and the district cleared me. Completely. I wrote every sentence down. Frank paused. Why are you asking? Someone is using the old article to question whether I should be working around residents at my apartment complex. That article? Yes. That's garbage. Maybe. But I need records, not opinions. Frank went quiet for a second. Then he said, That sounds like you. It was the first thing anyone had said in days that made me feel like myself. Later that afternoon, Craig found me in the office. He put a folder on the desk. Copies. Of what? My complaint. Emails too. I looked up. You don't have to give me those. I know. He leaned against the counter. If somebody's trying to make my complaint look connected to theirs, I want the dates clear. That was not friendship, but it was respect. I opened the folder. His first email to Marilyn had been sent almost 2 weeks before the anonymous memory complaint. His follow-up focused entirely on role boundaries and liability. Nothing about my age, nothing about grief, nothing about judgment. You were worried I was stepping on your job, I said. I was worried neither of us would know whose job it was when something went wrong. I nodded. Fair. Craig gave me a tired half smile. Don't get used to hearing me say I was right. I wasn't planning to. After he left, I added his dates to the timeline. The picture became cleaner. His complaint belonged to one problem. The anonymous campaign belonged to another. I closed the notebook and walked back toward my apartment. Halfway down the hall, Mrs. Ellis stepped out of her unit. Art, can I ask you something? Sure. My stove's acting up again. Front burner won't heat right. I stopped. Did you call the office? Not yet, I saw you. I should have told her to call Marilyn. Instead, habit took over. I pulled a small piece of paper from my pocket. Apartment 214. I wrote it down. Front burner. I'll make sure it gets logged. My phone began ringing before I finished the sentence. Melissa. I folded the paper, slipped it inside the notebook, and answered. Hello, Art? Her voice sounded different. Careful. Yeah. Can I ask you something? You just did. She did not laugh. That made me straighten. Did Eric contact Maple Court? I stopped walking. What? Did he call Marilyn or management? I looked down at the notebook in my hand. Why are you asking me that? Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. The kind of silence that comes when somebody is deciding how much truth they can afford to say. Melissa, I need to explain something. I leaned against the wall. No? First tell me why you asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I had spent weeks wondering who knew enough about my past to build that complaint. Now I was listening to someone who already seemed afraid of the answer. I asked her again why she wanted to know, and the silence before she answered told me she had been holding something back. Melissa finally spoke. Eric asked me some questions after he came to see you. I stayed against the hallway wall, the notebook still in my hand. What kind of questions? At first, normal ones. How you were doing after Nancy died. Whether you ever forgot appointments, whether you'd had trouble managing things when you were living alone. My grip tightened around the phone, and you answered him. Yes. Why? She exhaled. Because he said he was worried about you. That's not an answer. I know. Her voice dropped. He said Maple Court was giving you too much responsibility because nobody there knew what you were like when you were struggling. I looked down the empty hallway. What did you tell him? Melissa hesitated. I reminded him about the winter after Nancy died. My jaw tightened. The Miss Dentist appointment? Yes. The lunch with Frank? Yes. There was more than that. She was right. There had been days when grief turned simple things into work. I had once left my keys in the refrigerator after carrying groceries inside. I had fallen asleep in the recliner with the front door unlocked. Small, embarrassing things from a period when I was barely sleeping. None of them had lasted. None of them had followed me to Maple Court. What else? She answered quietly. I gave him some old messages. What messages? Things I sent him while you were living with us. I closed my eyes. Melissa, I know how it sounds. No, I don't think you do. She rushed forward. I thought Eric wanted to talk to you. He kept saying you were too proud to admit you might need family around. And you agreed? Part of me did. That was the first answer that sounded honest. She continued before I could respond. After you left, everything got harder. Not impossible, just harder. I was tired all the time. Eric and I were fighting. You seemed happy over there, and we were barely speaking to each other. So you wanted me back. She did not answer immediately. Yes. The word barely came through. I looked toward my apartment door. You didn't want me to come back because you missed me. Art. You wanted the house to start working the way it used to. That's not all it was, but it was part of it. Another pause. Yes. I appreciated the truth because it was ugly. Ugly truth was still better than a beautiful excuse. What messages did you give him? One was from the night the platter broke. Something cold moved through me. What about it? I had texted him before he got home. She sounded ashamed now. I wrote, I told him one thing and he still forgot. I remembered those words without ever having seen them. They sounded exactly like Melissa that night. And you sent that to Eric again? He asked if I still had it. Why? He said he wanted examples. Things that would make you understand why we were concerned. My voice hardened. Concerned enough to convince strangers I can't be trusted? I didn't know he was doing that. You knew he wanted ammunition. I thought he wanted to persuade you. Persuade me to do what? To come home. The answer landed harder than I expected, not because I had never suspected it, because she had finally said it plainly. You wanted my new life to fail. No, not completely. Art, I didn't want you ruined. Then what did you want? Her voice cracked with frustration. I thought if things got difficult enough over there, maybe you'd reconsider. That's all. I almost laughed. That's all? I know it sounds terrible. It sounds accurate. She went quiet again. Then she said, there's something else. I waited. When Eric and I fought last night, I asked him what he actually told people about you. My heartbeat slowed. And? He mentioned the platter. I straightened. What did he say? That you were specifically told not to touch something important, and you forgot anyway. That it was an example of what he meant. For several seconds, I could not speak. I had broken that platter. I had hurt Melissa. That part belonged to me. But Eric had taken one painful accident and carried it into the office of strangers as evidence that something was wrong with my mind. Melissa's voice sharpened. I told him that wasn't what happened. It did happen, not the way he was using it. There was anger in her now, real anger. I told him, that was about my mother. You turned it into evidence. I sat down on the bench near the mailboxes. What did he say? That it was still true. Of course he did. Technically true. That seemed to be becoming the language of whatever Eric was building. Melissa continued, he keeps saying those people at Maple Court don't really know you, that they're making you feel more capable than you actually are. I stared at the floor. More capable? He said you like being the person everyone depends on, that they're feeding it. And you believed him? Not anymore? I let out a slow breath. You don't get to stand on the clean side of this now, Melissa. I know. No. Eric may have taken it further. But you handed him private things because part of you wanted me uncomfortable enough to come back. I know. This time she did not defend herself. That mattered. It did not absolve her. I ended the call a few minutes later without promising anything. By then I knew Melissa had helped load the gun. What I still didn't know was exactly what Eric intended to shoot down. The voicemail came through 2 days before the review. Marilyn called me into the office just after lunch and closed the door behind me. Regional sent over the material they're using, she said. Because this call is part of what they're considering about your position, they've approved letting you hear it. I sat across from her desk. Who left it? She did not answer. She only turned the computer speakers toward me and clicked play. Eric's voice filled the room. Calm, measured, almost gentle. Hi, this is Eric Whitaker. I'm calling about my father, Art Whitaker. I know he's been helping residents there, and I want to be clear that I'm not trying to cause trouble. I felt my hands go cold. He continued, my father is a good man. He always wants to help. Sometimes that's part of the problem. If Eric had sounded angry, I think it would have been easier. He didn't. He sounded like the son people trusted when they believed he was making a difficult call out of love. After my mother died, Dad had a rough period. Trouble sleeping. Missed appointments. He'd forget small things. Nothing dangerous, but enough that the family noticed. I stared at Marilyn's desk. There was Nancy again, dragged into this. Eric moved on to the platter. He recently broke something important after being specifically asked not to touch it. I know accidents happen. I'm only mentioning it because there's been a pattern of him taking on more than he should. Not one word was technically false. That was what made it ugly. He mentioned Jefferson Middle next. There was also an incident during his career involving a school boiler. I'm sure he has his version of it, but his name was involved in the investigation. I think management should know the full picture before putting too much responsibility on him. His version. I nearly laughed. The contractor had substituted the wrong part. The district had cleared me, but Eric did not say I caused the failure. He did not need to. He simply placed the headline next to Nancy's death, the platter, and my age, then let the listener build the conclusion for him. The voicemail ended with the same language that had appeared in the written concern. Dad means well. He just tends to get in over his head when too many people depend on him. I'd rather somebody be cautious now than regret it later. Then silence. Marilyn stopped the recording. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she asked, "That's your son?" "Yes. I'm sorry." I looked at the screen. I'm not sure he thinks he said anything wrong. That was the part I was beginning to understand. Eric was not inventing facts. He was curating them. One accident. One period of grief. One misleading old headline. One personality trait I could not even deny. I did take on too much. I always had. Each piece by itself was true. Put together without context, they produced someone I barely recognized, an aging man whose judgment was slipping, a well-meaning liability. Somebody others should stop trusting before he caused trouble. He never directly says you're incompetent, Marilyn said. No. He doesn't say you caused the boiler problem. No. He doesn't even say you have a medical condition. No. She looked at me. That feels deliberate. It is. I stood and walked toward the window. My first instinct was to call Eric, ask him exactly what the hell he thought he was doing, make him hear what his own voice sounded like when it was played back in a room where my future was being discussed. I took out my phone. His name was near the top of my recent calls. My thumb hovered over it. Then I put the phone away. If I called him now, I would get explanations. Concern, family, misunderstanding, maybe anger. What I needed was a record. I need a copy of everything management is willing to provide me, I said. Marilyn nodded. They'll send the review packet this afternoon. And the voicemail? It's already included. Good. I returned to the desk. What happens at this review? They'll look at your work history here, the complaints, the boiler documentation, your job boundaries, and anything else relevant. My position? Yes. She hesitated. And the resident assistance system. I frowned. What about it? If regional decides the arrangement creates too much uncertainty about responsibility, they may scale it back or discontinue it. That hit me harder than losing 12 paid hours a week. The system was working. Residents knew who to call. Requests were being tracked. Craig was not chasing 3 versions of the same complaint. If Eric's campaign ended that too, the damage would reach beyond me. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing. Dates, emails, Craig's complaint, the request for the Jefferson Middle report, my notes from Frank. I opened the notebook I had used to build the timeline and flipped toward the back, looking for a date I had written down. Something fell into my lap, a folded scrap of paper. Apartment 214. Front burner not heating. Mrs. Ellis. I stared at it. Then at the date written in the corner. My stomach dropped. I finally had my son's voice attached to the campaign against me. And sitting in my own handwriting was proof that at least one thing he feared had actually happened. The scrap of paper should not have mattered as much as it did. It was one missed request. One burner on one stove. No fire, no injury, no emergency. But I sat at my kitchen table staring at my own handwriting as if it had accused me out loud. Apartment 214, front burner not heating. Mrs. Ellis. I remembered the moment immediately. She had stopped me in the hallway. Melissa called before I finished talking to her. I folded the note, slipped it into my notebook, and told myself I would enter it later. Then I forgot. For several minutes, Eric's voicemail played again in my head. He takes on too much. People depend on him. He gets in over his head. I hated how quickly those words found the weakest place in me. What if he was right? Not about everything, but enough. I stood, carried the notebook to the table, and opened the work order records Marilyn had emailed me. If I was going to question myself, I wanted facts. Over the previous weeks, I had logged dozens of resident requests, heating complaints, appliance problems, loose railings, plumbing issues, vendor follow-ups. Most had been entered the same day. Priority items had been escalated. Residents had been contacted when parts were delayed. I found one mistake, Mrs. Ellis. One preventable mistake in a system I had helped design specifically so people would not have to rely on memory. That was what embarrassed me most. I had not failed because I was incapable. I had failed because I had stepped outside the process. Again, the same old habit. Someone needed something. I said, I'll take care of it. Then I carried it personally instead of putting it where everyone could see it. I called Marilyn before I could talk myself into waiting. I found something you need to know. Her voice sharpened. What? I told her. All of it. The hallway request, the scrap of paper, the missed entry. How long ago? Several days. Was it reported any other way? I don't think so. She was quiet. I'm going to check. I'll come with you. Art, you're suspended. I know. I'm not going to touch the stove. I owe Mrs. Ellis an apology. Marilyn met me outside Mrs. Ellis's apartment 20 minutes later. Mrs. Ellis looked surprised to see both of us. I did not soften it. You told me about your stove, and I said I'd make sure it was logged. I didn't. That was my mistake. She looked from me to Marilyn. I figured everybody was busy. That doesn't make it acceptable. Marilyn asked whether the stove was still usable. Mrs. Ellis said the other burners worked normally. She had simply stopped using the bad one. No one had been hurt. Craig checked the unit later and determined the burner assembly needed replacement. A service appointment was scheduled. The world did not end, but something in me shifted. Back in Marilyn's office, Craig stood beside the desk while I placed the folded note in front of them. "No more of these," I said. Craig looked at it. "Agreed." Marilyn opened the work order system. "If somebody stops you in a hallway, I tell them to call the office. Or I can enter it immediately while they're standing there." Craig nodded. "No side notebooks. No promises you'll remember later. No unofficial work. No resident saying, 'Art told me it was fine,' when I've never seen it." I almost smiled. "You've been waiting to say that for weeks." The three of us wrote down the rule before we left the room. Every request entered the shared system. Every request received a time and date. Nothing lived only in my memory. Nothing belonged to me personally. That last part stayed with me. For years at Eric's house, I had made myself the answer to everything. Need a contractor? Ask Dad. Need the model number? Ask Dad. Need dinner handled? Dad already did it. I had blamed Eric and Melissa for becoming dependent on me. They deserved part of that blame, but I had also made dependence easy, maybe even satisfying. Being needed had become proof that I mattered. At Maple Court, I had started doing it again, just in a kinder place. That realization hurt almost as much as Eric's betrayal. My phone buzzed on the desk. Melissa. Not a call this time. A screenshot. Her message above it read, "I didn't understand what he meant before. I do now." I opened the image. It was part of a conversation between her and Eric. Melissa had written, "You need to stop calling people about your father." Eric's reply was underneath, "You don't understand. Once nobody there needs him anymore, he'll come home." I read the sentence twice, then a third time, and suddenly the complaints, the old article, the platter, even the way Eric had stared at my name on the board at Maple Court began rearranging themselves into something far worse than concern. The message said, "Once nobody there needs him anymore, he'll come home." I kept reading Eric's message until the words stopped looking like words. Once nobody there needs him anymore, he'll come home. That was when the shape of the whole thing finally became clear. Eric had never believed losing 12 hours of part-time work would ruin me financially. He knew better than that. He knew I had a pension. He knew I had Social Security. He knew I could pay my rent and buy groceries without asking him for a dime. Money was never the lever. Belonging was. Maple Court had given me something Eric had not expected me to find anywhere else. A reason to get up in the morning, people who trusted my judgment, a place where my name meant something besides Dad. Eric had seen it himself. He had stood beneath that resident services board and watched people greet me in the hallway. And somewhere between that visit and the calls to management, he had decided that if he could take away the trust, the rest would collapse on its own. My phone was still in my hand. I called Melissa. She answered quickly. "You saw it?" "Yes." I didn't understand what he meant when he first started saying things like that. "What things?" She hesitated. "That Maple Court was making you too comfortable." I closed my eyes. "How long ago?" "After he visited you." "Of course. He said strangers were making you feel important, that you'd never come back as long as everyone there kept treating you like they needed you." "And what did you say?" "Silence." "Melissa." I didn't stop him. That answer hurt more because I already knew why. "You hoped he was right?" "Yes." She sounded ashamed. "I didn't think he meant he was going to call management. I thought maybe he'd say something to you. Maybe make you realize that place wasn't family. So if Maple Court became uncomfortable enough, I'd come home." "Yes." "To what?" She did not answer. I answered for her. Dinner, repairs, laundry, appointments, the house running the way it used to. It wasn't only that. "No. Eric thought it would fix your marriage too." Her breathing changed. "How did you know?" "Because I finally understand him." In Eric's mind, the solution was simple. I came home. The household stopped feeling so difficult. Melissa stopped pointing out all the things I used to handle. Eric stopped hearing my name every time she complained about what he had not done. And perhaps, if enough pressure disappeared, the two of them could pretend nothing deeper had ever been wrong. My failure would become their reset button. I ended the call and sat alone for a long time. Then Nancy's voice came back to me. Not from after she got sick, years earlier. Eric had been 16 and halfway through rebuilding an old bicycle in our garage. He got bored, left the parts spread across my workbench, and went to a friend's house. I finished it. When Nancy saw me tightening the last bolt, she leaned against the garage door and said, "You know what you're teaching him? That his father knows how to fix a bicycle?" "No." She looked at the scattered tools. That every unfinished job belongs to somebody else. I had laughed. He's 16. He won't always be. At the time, I thought she was being too hard on him. Now I wondered if I had been too soft. Not because helping your child is wrong, because I had confused helping with preventing consequence. Forgot a deadline? Dad reminded him. Car making a strange noise? Dad handled it. Argument with someone? Dad explained what Eric had probably meant. I had spent years stepping between my son and the natural weight of unfinished things. Eric had chosen what he was doing now. That belonged to him completely. But I could no longer pretend the pattern had appeared from nowhere. For most of his life, when Eric dropped something, I picked it up. Now his marriage was breaking, his house felt harder to manage, and his father had built a life elsewhere. Eric had dropped more than he could carry. So he was trying to make it my emergency. Not this time. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for the review. The final Jefferson Middle report had arrived. I printed the contractor findings, the serial number records, Craig's complaint, the work order history, my written acknowledgement of the missed stove request, and the new procedure Marilyn, Craig, and I had created. Then I printed Eric's voicemail transcript. Last came the screenshots Melissa had sent me. They were different. Those messages did more than prove Eric had contacted Maple Court. They exposed his marriage, his resentment, his fear that Melissa respected me more than him, his belief that removing my new life would bring me back and possibly save his old one. They could humiliate him. For a few minutes, I imagined setting every page on the review table. Let them see exactly what kind of man had tried to damage his father's reputation. Then I remembered why I was going there. To defend mine. I placed the screenshots in a separate envelope and sealed it. The next morning I carried those private messages into the review building and left them sealed inside my briefcase. I carried the sealed envelope into the review room and never opened it. Regional management had booked a small conference room at their office on the north side of Columbus. Marilyn sat to my left. Craig sat farther down the table with a folder in front of him. Across from us were the regional property manager and a woman from risk management who had already read every complaint sent about me. Nobody looked hostile. That almost made it harder. The regional manager began with a summary of why we were there. But before she reached the stove request, I raised my hand. There's something I want on the record first. She nodded. I placed a copy of the work order in front of her. A resident told me about a faulty stove burner in the hallway. I wrote it on a piece of paper and failed to enter it into the official system. The repair was delayed several days. The risk manager looked up. You're acknowledging that? Yes. I explained that nobody had been harmed, but that was not the point. I had created a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of mistake, then stepped outside it because I trusted myself to remember. I showed them the new procedure Marilyn, Craig, and I had adopted. Every request entered immediately. No private scraps of paper, no unofficial promises, no maintenance work outside my assigned role. I made the mistake, I said. I corrected the process that allowed it. The woman from risk management made a note. Then we moved to Jefferson Middle. I handed over the complete district report. The original newspaper article sat beside it. The headline made my old decision look reckless. The investigation did not. I pointed to the equipment specification, the contractor invoice, the serial number photographed after the failure, and the finding that an uncertified component had been substituted after my approval. My signature authorized this component, I said, touching the original specification. That is not the component they installed. The regional manager read the conclusion quietly. So the district cleared you? Yes. And the contractor altered its documentation? Yes. Craig spoke next. His testimony was shorter. I complained about art. The risk manager looked at him. Why? Because residents were pulling him into informal maintenance work. He was crossing into my responsibilities, and I thought eventually somebody would get hurt or something would be damaged, and nobody would know who authorized what. Did you question his memory? No. His judgment? Only his ability to mind his own job description. Marilyn coughed into her hand to hide a laugh. Even I smiled. Craig continued. He listened after I pushed the issue. The stove request proved we needed a tighter system, but that's different from saying the man can't do the work. Then Marilyn presented the numbers. Before my coordinator role existed, resident complaints were often duplicated because people did not know whether their requests had been received. Vendor visits were occasionally missed because nobody tracked confirmation calls. Routine repairs sometimes disappeared beneath louder but less important requests. After the new system went into place, unresolved requests dropped. Duplicate complaints fell. Residents received follow-up calls more consistently. The numbers did not say I was perfect. They said the work was improving. Finally, the voicemail played. Hearing Eric's voice in that room felt different than hearing it with Marilyn. He sounded so reasonable. Nancy, the platter, Jefferson Middle, my habit of taking on too much. 4 separate truths placed beside one another until they became a fifth thing that was not true at all. When the recording ended, the regional manager asked me whether I disputed any specific event Eric described. No. She seemed surprised. The platter broke? Yes. You struggled after your wife died? Yes. Your name appeared in the boiler investigation? Yes. And you recently missed a work request? Yes. The room went quiet. I leaned forward. Every event happened. The story built by putting them together did not. The risk manager watched me carefully. I continued. One accident doesn't establish a pattern of confusion. Grief almost 2 years ago doesn't establish incapacity today. A misleading newspaper headline doesn't erase the investigation that followed it, and one work order mistake doesn't cancel everything that was processed correctly. I could feel the sealed envelope inside my briefcase near my foot. Eric's messages could have made his motive obvious. Melissa's messages could have made him look small, bitter, desperate. I left them where they were. We broke for 20 minutes while management discussed the decision. When they called us back, the regional manager spoke plainly. My position would be reinstated, but not exactly as before. I would remain resident services coordinator. Craig would retain all physical maintenance authority. Marilyn would control the official work order log. No resident request could depend solely on something I remembered, promised, or wrote privately. 6 months earlier, I might have heard those restrictions as an insult. Now I understood them differently. A good system should not collapse because one person gets sick, takes vacation, retires, or walks out the door. That was not weakness. That was the point. Outside, Marilyn glanced at my briefcase. You never used the other messages. I didn't need them. They might have made this easier. They would have made Eric look worse. She waited. I said, I came here to clear my name. I didn't come here to become my son. Then I stepped away, took out my phone, and called Eric myself. Dad, we need to talk. A pause. When? 6 o'clock, Maple Court. At 6 that evening, my son walked toward me, expecting another argument. I had only one question. Did you make those calls? Did you make those calls? Eric stopped a few feet from me. For a second, he looked like he might pretend not to understand. Then his jaw tightened. If you mean, did I call Maple Court? Yes. The answer came easier than I expected. We were standing outside the community room, far enough from the entrance that nobody had to walk around us. Why? Eric gave a short laugh. Dad, come on. You already know why. I want to hear you say it. His expression hardened. I was concerned. That's the answer you gave Maple Court. Because it's true. He folded his arms. Everything I told them happened. I nodded. Yes. That stopped him. He had clearly expected an argument. The platter broke, I said. I forgot what Melissa told me. Eric watched me carefully. I had a rough stretch after your mother died. He said nothing. My name appeared in the Jefferson Middle investigation. I took another breath. And I missed a work request here. Eric spread his hand. Exactly. Exactly. He frowned. I stepped closer. You didn't invent the truth, Eric. You arranged it until it told the lie you needed. His face changed. That's ridiculous. Was I cleared in the boiler investigation? You were involved. That wasn't my question. He looked away. Was I cleared? Yes. Did the period after your mother died continue for almost 2 years? No. Do I forget things constantly? I didn't say constantly. No. You were careful not to. His arms dropped. That doesn't mean I was wrong to be worried. Then why didn't you call me? I tried talking to you. You asked when I was coming home. That was part of it. What was the rest? He began pacing. You want to know what happened after you left? I do. The house became a nightmare. I said nothing. Not because we can't wash clothes or buy groceries, because there was always something. A service appointment, a bill, a repair, some stupid thing in the garage. Melissa would ask me whether I had handled it, and half the time I didn't even know it needed handling. His voice was getting louder. She started keeping score. Sound familiar? He ignored that. She'd say, your dad used to know who to call. Or, your dad would have noticed that before it got worse. There it was, not missing me, being measured against me. Eric looked toward the main building. Then I came here. I remembered the coffee, the smile, the box in his arms. You looked happy, he said. I was. That's not what I mean. He rubbed both hands over his face. You were everywhere. People knew you. Marilyn was asking what you thought. That woman practically thanked you like you saved her life over a refrigerator. It was a dirty condenser coil. I know what it was. His voice cracked slightly. You left our house, and 3 months later you were over here being everybody's dependable guy. I stared at him. To you, that was an insult? It felt like you were proving a point. What point? That you didn't need us. I didn't build this life to punish you. Well, it felt like punishment. I took out my phone. There's something else. I opened the screenshot Melissa had sent and held it toward him. He read the message. Once nobody there needs him anymore, he'll come home. The anger went out of his face. Not guilt, recognition. He knew he had run out of room. That was private. So was my grief. He handed the phone back. I was frustrated. You called my employer. I was trying to make people careful. You were trying to make them stop trusting me. He looked away. Why, Eric? Nothing. I waited. Why? His shoulders dropped. You were supposed to come home. The words were so simple I almost missed how much they explained. I said, why? Because everything fell apart after you left. No. He looked at me. Everything you were making me hold together fell apart. That's easy for you to say. No, it isn't. I told him I had spent years making his life easier because I thought that was what a father did. Sometimes it was. Other times, I had stepped in too quickly. I helped create part of this, I said. I taught you that when something became uncomfortable enough, I would eventually handle it. His expression softened for the first time. Then help me now. There it was, even after everything. With what? Talk to Melissa. No. He blinked. Dad. No. She'll listen to you. That's exactly why I'm not doing it. He stared at me. You're just going to let my marriage fall apart? It's your marriage. She's angry because of all this. She's angry because of choices both of you made. Eric shook his head. You could fix this. I probably could make one conversation easier. Then do it. No. I had never realized how hard that word would be to say to my son, or how clean it would feel afterward. I took one last paper from my folder. You contacted Maple Court and other people with a version of my life that left out facts you knew mattered. Eric looked at the paper. What is that? A list of the corrections you need to make. He laughed once. You're serious? Yes. You want me to apologize to everybody? I want you to correct the record. The boiler investigation cleared me. The stove mistake was isolated and corrected. Your concerns were shaped by family conflict, nothing more. And if I don't, I've documented every call I know about. If you interfere with my life again, I won't handle it as a family disagreement. He studied me for a long time. Then he said quietly, Then I really am losing everything. I looked at my son and finally refused to pick up what he had dropped. No, you're finally being asked to carry it. Melissa asked to meet me at a coffee shop about a week after my conversation with Eric. When I walked in, she was already sitting near the window with both hands wrapped around a cup she had barely touched. She stood when she saw me. Thanks for coming. I sat across from her. For once, Melissa did not begin by explaining herself. I owe you an apology. I waited. She looked down at the table. I had every right to be upset about my mother's platter. Yes, you broke it after I asked you not to touch it. Yes. She nodded, almost as if she needed me to confirm that part before she could continue. But I used that moment to say things I had been thinking for months. I treated every mistake you made like proof that you were a burden, while I treated everything you did for us like it was expected. That was closer to the truth than I had expected. Melissa swallowed. I didn't miss you at first. I said nothing. I missed everything you did. The words landed without drama. That was why they hurt. She continued. I missed coming home to dinner already started. I missed not thinking about repair appointments. I missed knowing somebody had noticed the trash schedule, the filters, the little things I never even thought about. At least you know the difference now. I do. Knowing it doesn't erase it. I know that too. She told me she was still living separately from Eric. He had apparently assumed that correcting what he had done to me might convince her to come home. It had not. I told him fixing what he did to you isn't some kind of payment toward getting me back, Melissa said. It's the minimum. I almost smiled. That sounded like something she should have understood months earlier. 2 days later, Eric sent the corrections. They were short. No emotional confession. No praise. He acknowledged that the Jefferson Middle investigation had ultimately cleared me. He stated that the missed stove request at Maple Court had been an isolated mistake followed by a documented correction. He admitted that family conflict had influenced the way he presented his concerns. He sent the statement to the people and management contacts he had approached. For a man who had spent months arranging facts to control what others believed, having to dismantle his own story was punishment enough for me. I did not need him humiliated. I needed the lie removed. A week later, I went back to Eric's house for the rest of my belongings. It was the first time I had walked through that front door since the night he pointed me out of it. The house was not falling apart. Eric was not helpless. But without somebody constantly catching small things before they became visible, the place looked different. Mail had accumulated on the counter. Laundry sat unfolded in a basket near the stairs. Several takeout containers were stacked beside the trash. The grass needed cutting. A slow drip sounded from the downstairs bathroom. Eric noticed me listening. Faucet. I figured. I tightened the handle. Didn't help. He looked at me. You know how to fix it? Yes. He waited. For years, that pause would have been enough. I took out my phone. Eric's expression changed slightly as I searched my contacts. Then I texted him a number. What's that? Plumber I've used before. He stared at the screen. You're not even going to look at it? I already did. And? Call him. There was no anger in my voice. That seemed to bother him more than anger would have. We went upstairs. My remaining things filled 3 boxes. At the bottom of the closet sat the old leather household notebook. I picked it up and handed it to him. What's this? Everything you keep calling me about. He opened it. Furnace model. Water heater service dates. Roof contractor. Garage door company. Appliance warranties. Trash. Schedule. Emergency numbers. Eric flipped through several pages. You had all this written down? For years. Relief crossed his face. I stopped him before he could misunderstand. That book is information. It isn't another version of me. He looked at me. I carried the last box outside. Several months passed. Maple Court settled into a routine that no longer depended entirely on me. Craig handled maintenance. Marilyn controlled the official log. Residents submitted requests properly. I coordinated, followed up, and occasionally told people, not today. The first few times, guilt followed me home. Then something strange happened. Nobody stopped liking me. Dot still invited me for coffee when she had nothing broken. Marilyn still asked how my week was. Craig still complained about my coffee. One Saturday evening, Maple Court held a community dinner. I was halfway through a piece of pie when people began clearing plates. My chair moved before I realized I was standing. Dot touched my sleeve. Sit down, Art. I can help. Someone else has it. I looked around. 2 residents were already careless. Toward the kitchen, nobody was looking at me impatiently. Nobody was waiting for me to earn my dinner. So I sat back down. For the first time, I understood that I did not have to work for my chair. My son gave me 3 days before I came crawling back. I never did. What took me much longer to understand was that I never should have had to crawl for a place in my own family. What stays with me most about Art's story is that his greatest victory was not proving his son wrong. It was realizing that love should never require a person to earn their place in a family by constantly cooking, fixing, organizing, paying, forgiving, or cleaning up everyone else's mistakes. Art made errors too. He broke something precious, missed a work request, and spent years making life too easy for Eric by stepping in whenever his son failed to carry his own responsibilities. But there is an important difference between admitting a mistake and allowing someone to use that mistake to define your entire worth. If there is a lesson here, it is to set boundaries before resentment becomes the language of a relationship. Help the people you love, but do not make yourself responsible for every problem they refuse to solve. When you make a mistake, own it and correct it. When someone mistreats you, do not answer cruelty with cruelty simply because you finally have the power to hurt them back. Protect your name, tell the truth, and let people experience the consequences of their own choices. Eric and Melissa did not lose Art because he stopped loving them. They lost the version of Art who would sacrifice his dignity to keep their lives comfortable. In the end, Art discovered something many people learn far too late. Being needed can feel like love, but real love still gives you a seat at the table when you have nothing to fix, nothing to provide, and nothing left to prove.